Hi, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Brighton Nguyen, and I'm a fourth-year civil engineering student in the Albert Merkin School of Engineering at the Cooper Union. Cooper Union Climate Week 2020 is a series of lectures and events addressing our shared future through the lens of global Green New Deals, environmental racism, and community action. We aim to promote curiosity, interdisciplinary dialogue, and sustained engagement with the climate crisis. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land of the Lenape people upon which the Cooper Union stands today. The Cooper Climate Coalition is dedicated to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone. Please note, no hate speech or offensive language of any kind will be tolerated in the chat. If you have any viewing issues, please email us at climate@cooper.edu. Today, we'll be hearing from Kendra Krueger and Omar Gowayed in a conversation entitled Science for Liberation. Omar Gowayed is a PhD candidate in materials chemistry at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering and currently serves as a co-chair of March for Science New York City. He specializes in non-photochemical laser-induced nucleation, a technique of shooting high-powered lasers to induce phase changes in certain liquid materials. Although his research is with lasers, he taught a vertical farming class called Urban Food Lab, in which students run sustainability and farm-focused mini projects to learn about research and design while working on an aquaponic farm. He was also a coordinator of NYU's Science Policy and Diplomacy course. Kendra Krueger is an intersectional scientist, educator, artist, and woman of color on many edges. Raised by artists, educated as an electrical engineer, and trained in anti-oppression, facilitation, theater, mindfulness, and permaculture, her work and research is a convergence of these fields. The intention of her work comes down to healing ourselves, our communities, and our earth. Her teaching and research pedagogy advocates that science can be transformative for the external and internal world if analytical and intuitive skill sets are combined. She founded For Love in Science as a platform to teach transformative science at universities, in K-12 schools, and in community spaces and gardens throughout the country. She has also developed performative and installation-based projects in collaboration with other artists. She currently works as a science educator at CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center, training scientists how to convey their work to youth and the public. Please join us tomorrow, September 29th, for a talk with Michael Wang, Nick Lutzko, and Jillian Schaefer at 6 p.m. Eastern Daily Time. Thank you both very much for joining us today, and now I'll pass it on to Kendra.
Hello. Hello. Am I here? Here I am. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to be talking here with Omar. So basically, we're just going to get right into it. And what we want to talk about tonight is how do you bring your science, how do you use your science as a tool for activism, but also bring activism into your work as scientists, or if you're not a scientist in general, how do you connect with the spirit of activism, and what are different entry points to get involved, and how can you use different ideas of science to connect those things together? So basically for me as a scientist, so I went to undergrad and graduate school for electrical engineering, but I always kind of was wondering how all of this technology and these ideas and philosophical ideas were actually helping society in a deeper way, but also helping me to learn more about myself and the world around me. So thinking about this and thinking about how there's different patterns and entry points okay, so I'm deciding which thing to talk about first, but in our conversation today, we're going to be talking about the four eyes of liberation, or the four pillars of liberation. And so that's based on the work of Paulo Freire. So Paulo Freire is a philosopher and activist that comes out of Brazil. And he works with this idea that in order to move out of these systems of oppression, so oppressive systems being those that make us feel like we're trapped, or make us feel like we don't have access or a sense of freedom in the world that we live in, that it's not only up to the people who have the power and are oppressing the people, but it's also up to those who feel oppressed to be able to create new visions and create new pathways for themselves to liberate ourselves. So from that idea and that philosophy, he created these four eyes of liberation that are used a lot in social justice work. And so I'm just gonna throw up a little picture here in my background that I created. Normally when you see these pictures, it's either in a four squares where it says, it basically starts with ideological over here. So this is the idea of like philosophical ideas that happen throughout the world, but then it goes into institutional and interpersonal, this way, this way, and then internal spheres. So these are basically different realms, philosophical realms that we can engage in through activism, but also through science. And the reason why I threw it up in this picture is because for me, these different realms are all interconnected. So this is a triple Klein bottle for the nerds out there. It's kind of, and the non-nerds, this is sort of an idea of a Mobius, a three-dimensional Mobius strip. And the Mobius strip is where all of the surfaces, if you think of a belt, how normally when you connect a belt, only the outside and the inside touch each other. But if you do it in a certain configuration, then the outside of the belt and the inside of the belt can be continuously touching. So it seems like you're always working on the same surface. So this is the same idea that all of these things are interconnected. And so I feel like this had a better representation of that complexity. So for this conversation, we're going to talk about those three eyes, or four eyes of what can be called four eyes of oppression, four eyes of liberation, or four spheres of getting involved in things. And another reason why I connect this with science is because in all these four different realms, there's different patterns and there's different systems that are playing out. And I believe that we live in a very fractal based universe. So fractals are like those patterns that you see that kind of repeat each other over and over into larger or smaller shapes. And that exists all throughout nature as well. So think about a shape like our hands. Our hands are in these like dendritic patterns. It's the same as what? Something like a tree, something like a river, but even smaller things like something like the way neurons and dendrites spread out in our nerve system. And then something like spiral systems, you see them in plants, you see them in the way that water moves, and also hexagonal patterns. Hexagonal patterns exist in the way that atoms arrange themselves in different materials, but also how beehives and the little spaces where the bees put their honey, but all the way to larger scales that you actually see hexagonal patterns that exist in the atmosphere of Jupiter as well, in the way that the gases are spiraling around the North Pole actually creates this hexagonal shape. So these patterns not only exist visually in these different ways through nature, but they also exist socially. We are enacting these patterns in different ways, like thinking about, again, the dendritic pattern can be seen as a hierarchical pattern, the way that power structures are divided into different ways. So we're going to look at what are different patterns that both Omar and I have observed in these four different spheres of systems, of social systems, and what are different experiences that we've had of engaging and being able to connect in those different spheres with these different patterns to find ways that we feel like we're feeling more liberated, that we're feeling more free, and finding more pathways for us to create new ways of living in the world. So I think with that, so talking about these dynamics and power structures, I'm going to hand it off to Omar to talk more about sort of power dynamics and power structures and introduce himself a little bit more.
Thank you, Kendra. I loved it. I love the discussion, even from like the material science perspective, from like the hexagonal to hexagonal material crystal structure. So hi everybody, name's Omar Gowayed. So I've been an activist my entire life. My parents took me to protests longer than I can remember. If you ask me what was the first protest I went to, I could tell you the first protest I remember. I can't tell you the first protest I went to. So my entire life, I've been taught how to recognize how to change something. So taught how to protest, where to petition, where to drop off this petition, how to collect the people around me. And it wasn't really until I was asked about it, where I was asked, somebody wanted to affect change in their department, and I think it was either undergrad or grad school, that I really had to speak to and understand what's going on. And that's when I started actually my education into activism, because activism, beyond just like being an activist, you have to, to a certain extent, if you want to be an effective activist, you have to know what you're doing and put words to the actions that you take. And so what I recognized was, in this academic infrastructure, there was a power structure, right? You have your trustees who are on top of the administration, who are the chairs of the university senate, which exists with the faculty senate, the student senate, and so how does it go in there, and how do you plug into that? So as a student who wants to, let's say for Climate Week, let's say you want to institute composting in your cafeteria. How do you identify who are the power players that you need to put this in? So you recognize, all right, I'm not going to go to the trustees and say, I want composting, right? You're going to see who's in charge of waste management. You're going to see who can make decisions around waste management in your institution. And then you're going to go to someone who has a little bit more power than you, maybe your student government, maybe your dean. Contact them, tell them, hey, this is something I really want. Here's something that's on my mind. Can this happen? Can we hire somebody to do this? Can we allocate funds? So recognizing the budget, and how does the budget play into all this? So like recognizing these different modes of power, where the resources are, this is what makes an effective activist. And it's also the ideology of where does power lie and what constitutes as power, right? So you can be the president of something, but if you don't have access to the budget in order to make budget adjustments and have things, and make a composting initiative happen, then you don't actually have power over that situation. So with that, I just wanted to introduce the concept of where is this power, so we can discuss how do we dismantle it. So we have all these power structures that already exist, these patterns that already exist, like white supremacy, for example, currently the fossil fuel industry, and it ties into our government, there ties into our entire economic infrastructure. So how do we recognize where do their tentacles lie within our system, and how do we dismantle it? How do we recognize where do these places that don't want us to have healthcare for all or a Green New Deal, what kind of power do they have in order for us to dismantle that power and dismantle their structures, and how do they tie into each other? So just like racial justice ties into climate justice, white supremacy ties into fossil fuel, ties into colonialism, ties into imperialism. So like, how does it all tie together, and how does it affect us, and how can we observe it, recognize the structures, and dismantle it, is something that ideologically we want to leave you with. The tool set, the toolkit. We're engineers, we like tools.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into our first realm that we're going to discuss, as you mentioned, ideological spaces, because a lot of these power structures, these power dynamics are telling different stories, right? It's all about what is the dominant narrative that's existing in our social consciousness. And I think as scientists, as non-scientists working in these spaces, we have to acknowledge what the dominant narratives are in order to start disrupting them. So again, as we're talking about all these different realms, it's depending on where your heart is drawing you and what your resources may be. There's different places where you can come in to disrupt these systems in different ways. So we're going to sort of start from the top and look at these realms from the top and go inward. So starting at the top with ideological spaces, ideological is kind of like the philosophical realm. So what are the stories that are told? What's the language that's happening? And in the US, our dominant system for science is this very Western kind of colonial based practice of science. And it's based in a lot of reductionism coming out of the Enlightenment from Europe. These ideas of how do we break things, reductionism being breaking things into smaller and smaller pieces in order to understand them. But now we're seeing that, you can't always break things into smaller pieces and still understand how the full system is working together. Also, there's this idea of sort of that's similar to dividing and conquering. Again, this colonialist idea of if we separate things or separate people or separate ideas, then we'll have more grasp or more control to be able to know and to understand them better. But one way that we can start to disrupt that is learning about other systems of thinking, other practices and methodologies of analyzing and interpreting information in different ways and creating different stories. So how do we start to educate in these different models, and then how do we start to speak and use that language as well? So one example of that for myself is recently there is a project happening in the Lower East Side in East Village, where I grew up in New York City, where the area there was terribly flooded during Hurricane Sandy, and there was a lot of damage. And now they're trying to create a better infrastructure, an actual construction of the waterfront there that's going to prevent flood damage. However, they wanted to do the right thing and have a community-based process, and there was a community design that was developed, but at the end the city flip-flopped, decided to go with their own design, and the new design does not include as many green-based infrastructure elements to it. So how does that connect with, again, the storytelling element? So we have some of these ideologies in science and engineering that we need to just build things that are going to be solid and strong, and just like build the wall and block the impeding forces that are coming. So that's kind of what this new design is based on. And the looking at the other alternatives, what are the other stories, is okay, well, let's look at the origin of this area. This area used to be a swampland. It used to be a marshland where the Lenni Lenape people tended to, and they knew that it was a marshland in which, when there were storms, like, the waters would rise, but then they would recede, and there wouldn't be so much damage because those marshlands are natural barriers for flood protection. But now we've wiped them out. I mean, we've built over it in our hubris and thought that we could sustain and fight against nature. So how, and this is the same thing that's happening in California that we're seeing right now, these with the fires that are becoming out of control. Now, again, if the indigenous people were allowed to tend to the land in the ways that they have practiced for thousands of years in fire mitigation, then we wouldn't be having this problem. So again, how do we honor some of this scientific knowledge from people who have had experience in these places and learn to design based on those practices and bring that into our philosophical way of building? And the other little piece that I want to add to that also is even, I like to tell stories about, we have this fear of uncertainty, and there's so much in science. We want to know more. We want to stake our claim in the land of knowing. Yet, how do we learn from the magic of uncertainty as well? And we have again, yeah, this fear. But how do we start to tell a different story, a different narrative that can be more playful and doesn't have to be all just based on logic and analysis? But what are other tools that we inherently use as analyzing through our more intuitive ways of knowing and practicing through our ancestral practices and so on. And then I'll pass it off to Omar to add more about that and about the colonial history of science.
But I really liked the way you introduced that it was a science. It's not like the Native American tending to land wasn't unscientific. It wasn't, there's this concept that, science is sort of this European Renaissance thing that happened, and now we're 400 years out of this scientific progress. But that's not true in any way, shape, or form. And I want you to think about it in the context. We all, at this point, all of us know that Columbus didn't discover America. There were already human beings in America. Not only that, there is evidence across the world of different cultures interacting with Native Americans and indigenous people in the Americas long before Columbus set foot. So when we go into this a little bit more, we realize science has been around for thousands of years. Humans didn't suddenly develop the concept of science. And not only that, the scientific method wasn't developed by Descartes, a European in the 1700s. It was developed, like the modern scientific method was developed by Ibn Haytham, the founder of modern optics. This includes the publication, systemic observation, all that lovely stuff. Even if you think about acceleration and gravity, so modern gravitational theory, who do you think of? Isaac Newton, right? Not Ibn Sina. Even though Ibn Sina was 1,000 years before Isaac Newton, or 700 to 1,000 years before Isaac Newton, he is the founder of modern gravitational acceleration, the understanding of modern gravitation. But somehow we skipped over him. We skipped over all these thinkers, all these mathematicians, all these brilliant people from around the world. We just somehow glossed over them just for this new thing, even though these Westerners built their sciences off of them. A lot of times you'll find so-called Western academics in the Renaissance era literally copied and pasted from works of African and Arab scientists. And so this is sort of recognition of this and recognition that we're in a racist settler colonial state, recognition that we do have this propaganda in our system. Like, we did learn that Columbus discovered America and that Descartes was the founder of the scientific method and all that. Once we recognize this, we start to recognize, there are different modes of expression, of scientific expression. There are different methods of scientific discovery. There are different methods of scientific communication. And so once we recognize this, you can take action and to, put a direct link it to something that we did recently as a department at NYU. The Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering department added a video component to our graduate applications, to where if you express yourself better orally, then you can express yourself. If you express yourself better written, then you can express yourself that way in your application to our graduate program, because we recognize that different cultures have different means and different methods that they can communicate with. And so this even goes into recognition, even in the climate circles. So, climate science, in the climate circles, we talk a lot about regenerative agriculture. So recently I was actually checked by people who are, scientists in this field, as well as activists within this field, who told me it's not regenerative agriculture, it is agroecology. So it is, there's actually a political movement around recognizing indigenous roots in agriculture, recognizing that carbon capture is not something that was newly discovered, but it's been something, these techniques have been things that have, been happening for thousands of years around the world. Recognition, even something in the ideological sense, recognition of, how racial justice ties into climate justice. We can't close down Rikers and make, a bunch of solar plants there just to move prisons, just to build new jails in every borough. We can't, if we're closing down a prison, if we're closing down a jail, then we need to think of what are alternatives to prisons. When we're making it to where some people are fighting fires and they're being paid, pennies on the dollar to fight these fires that are due to climate change and whatnot, then we need to make sure that, if they don't need to be in a prison, if they are productive members of society as they are there, if they're not, they're not horrible people who are going to destroy us immediately, blah, 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 which we can discuss on a different topic, how prisons make no sense, but and don't actually reform anyone, and there's no evidence that prisons help communities or keep us safe in any way, shape, or form. But we can discuss how it makes no sense for us to use prison labor in this way, and make sure and don't give people these jobs, don't give people the ability to be people. And so, tying in climate justice with this idea of dismantling white supremacy, dismantling racism, dismantling colonialism. We can't keep invading people for oil. We can't keep, brutalizing people. We can't destabilize and launch coups in Latin America for their lithium reserves. We have to, if we're going to move forward, we have to do so in a way that dismantles the systems that got us to this place in the first place. They're not going to take us out of it. And the last thing I really want to say is, even within the scientific community, our history has been erased. So, for example, when you think Einstein, do you think that he's a socialist thinker who, published works on why socialism? When you think of Irene Curie, do you think of a communist who was detained at the border at Ellis Island when she was coming to America, and she was met by Einstein after she got out because she was a staunch anti-fascist? Do you think of Percy Julian, a civil rights activist who's also a scientist? Like, do you think of these important scientists as just people who stayed in the lab and died in the lab, or do you think of them within their political context, within their role, how they saw their role in society? And if, before this, we were told that a lot of you are incoming freshmen and are undergrads. If as a scientist, you have to consider your role in community, you will be creating things and building things and designing things that have the ability to do amazing work, amazing things, or you can contribute to the continuation of this white supremacy and this evil and colonialism, destruction of the planet. With that, it's important. I'd like to just sign off by saying it's important to have evidence-based creation of movements, and hand it back to Kendra.
Yes, Omar, that's a really great mention of those scientists, because so often we just glorify them for the technical work that they do and sort of cut out all these other elements. And I feel like that is such, again, another pattern where we divide the person and divide also the social context of what's happening in the world with the science. We like to keep everything separated and not see the full story. But in full reality, these folks were also operating under oppressive systems and wanting to dismantle them and bring them down. And so how, again, do we look at what are these systems? What are the institutions? Because you also talked about power, and where is the power held, and who has the ability to make these changes. And in our society right now, so many of these institutions, right, hold the power. So that's our next realm that we're going to move into, is institutions. How do we work within institutions to create change? And as we know, what happens in these institutions is a lot of the power is held by folks from the white dominant culture. So that many of the decisions that are made with the resources that these institutions have are going to benefit the people who come from those backgrounds. Maybe not, intentionally. It's possible that people want to help others, but how do you fully help other people when you don't have the same experience or you don't come from the same background? So how do we work to, so some of the work that I like to play in is, how do we democratize this power? How do we democratize the system, the decision making, but also the science making? How can we spread the science making out so that it's not just folks who come from particular backgrounds who happen to have resources to rise up in the ranks to have these certain degrees or be in these programs, but because again, like the knowledge that we have as scientists is only one type of knowledge. And how do we also value knowledge from people who live all over and come from different backgrounds as well, and may not be as technical, but may have just as much merit in the way that of thinking, of critical thinking and problem solving skills. So one program that I've been working at CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center is what we're calling the Community Sensor Lab. And the whole idea behind that is, again, to sort of to not just bring science out into communities, but also to bring the knowledge of communities into the scientific community too, because there needs to be more of that direct exchange, because we have to think about reciprocity and relationship reciprocity of how we're exchanging resources. And we can't just have this savior mentality of, we will come bring you this resource that will lift you out of your situation, but to see value that maybe like we're actually losing out too, in terms of diversity of ideas and solutions, and that we need more people to come and work with us. So with the Community Sensor Lab, we're building these DIY environmental sensors. Right now, we're focused on a CO2 air quality sensor. And the idea is we learn together how to build them using DIY electronics, things like Arduinos and Raspberry Pis. And then we also learn how to teach other people. So we're creating different like how-to manuals, doing TikTok videos, doing any kind of like, how do we learn not just to do something technical, but also learn how to advocate, to teach others, and then how to use the data to advocate for our communities. So a lot of research that happens in, again, these institutions is people with resources going to collect data about these communities or about systems or ecosystems around the world that they may not be a part of, and then analyzing the data. But because, again, if you're not coming from that community, you may not have a full perspective and a full story, because as we're finding out, data is not infallible. There's still a level of interpretation that has to be done with the data. So data is not a pure thing. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to put the data into the hands of the people, and that the people can learn how to collect their own data and then advocate for themselves. And that way we can have more of that power that's distributed across communities. So, and I think that Omar's got some great stories too, talking about how March for Science is doing similar stuff around the city.
Absolutely. So March for Science, thank you, Kendra. And I love your democratization of material resources. And I actually want to have two fronts here. So there's engaging with the public and there's engaging with your colleagues, right? So engaging with the public, March for Science New York City, our goal is we're scientists who have access to this treasure trove of information, right? And we understand a lot of this information. And so we want to make it accessible. So we want to relay this information to the general public. So if you follow a March for Science page, you'll usually find, a peer-reviewed study or something like that being summarized on our pages. And how does it relate to, democracy? How does it relate to your healthcare? How does it relate to your food security? How does it relate to your human rights? And so that's something that we like to do, is to sort of build these relationships and inform the public about these relationships, so the public with this information can mobilize and fight for the good causes that they need to fight for. For example, recently, I can't see you guys, but I'm assuming you guys are familiar with the climate clock that went up in Union Square. So the climate clock team approached the March for Science team in order to do two things. One, to have a couple of our students make climate clocks of their own, but then also to think of how can we message the climate clock scientifically, and make sure that they had evidence-based data and whatnot, but make sure that this evidence-based data is communicated properly so that it is a scientific concept. So the clock, of course, as Kendra said, science is filled with uncertainty. The clock does have uncertainty of some time, but what it does communicate is we must act immediately, that we must take drastic action immediately. If you go to the climateclock.world, you'll notice that the shift, if you limited investment and slow investment will still result in catastrophic problems. Well, if we take immediate, powerful action now, we're able to combat climate change effectively and potentially even reverse the global warming to pre-industrial levels. So March for Science also does organizing within the community. So something that we like to focus on is bringing scientists together to discuss certain topics, sustainability, racial justice. We have a BIPOC exclusive space for scientists who are Black, Indigenous, or POC to come and talk to each other and organize with one another about how can they build power, what have they done. Something that we really like to relate to one another in all our spaces is the actions we're taking on our campus. So, individually as students, we are also getting involved in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion things on campus. So that earlier when I talked about changing graduate admissions, that came through that committee. That came through messaging our department chair and making sure that these things happen. But also, we like to organize with the unions. because the resource, as mentioned, resources and making sure that students have access to resources. So make sure you have adequate pay, healthcare, whatnot. That makes a huge difference in scientific achievement. Imagine the scientists that could not be scientists because they couldn't afford to be scientists. So, also imagine the power dynamics at play in the university. Imagine how much power does your advisor have over your entire life because your advisor controls your funding. So imagine if that advisor is racist or sexist or not a good person. I mean, scientists are humans. So, we do have our racist and sexist people. So how, if you are a researcher, a young researcher trying to do this, your science is being clouded over by this person who's an asshole. And so how do you balance that? And recently, actually, one of the professors in our department published about the importance of federal research money going directly to the grad students, about control over your own money, and the importance and the power, and how that will increase diversity and inclusion within a department by creating this change in power dynamic. And with that, I want to talk about the interpersonal relationships, because I did mention just interpersonal relationship between advisor and advisee. I'd like to open it up for Kendra's interpersonal.
Oh, going straight to me. So yeah, that is a great segue, talking about funding and power dynamics and relationships, because this is basically how power dynamics work. There's a unequal distribution of decision making based on a resource that needs to be shared. But because somebody can decide and somebody doesn't have the ability to decide on that, then you create this hierarchical pattern. And so I've been thinking about different ways to just disrupt this in subtle ways in the places where I work. Just thinking about, so first, often in academia, right, we have this hierarchy of students, faculty, and higher up administrators and so forth. And if you have let's say like a panel discussion, then typically maybe it's a panel discussion for students and they'll have the students talking, or a panel discussion and it'll be just the professors talking or the higher ups talking. But how do we start to maybe design some panel discussions where you have a student, undergraduate and a graduate student and a professor or faculty member and an administrator, and maybe somebody who works maintenance in the building as well, to have conversations about these things? And okay, maybe not everyone is an expert in XYZ, but then how do you ask the questions where all these people can be together in a room and create spaces where those power dynamics can shift? But there's so much discomfort around that too. So how do we face this discomfort? So in this interpersonal realm, it's a lot about building these relationships and figuring out how to build trust as well. Because I think the biggest challenge in shifting the existing system is figuring out how to connect with each other, to find that sense of humanity and say that I'm not going to take advantage of you if you give up some of your power in the situation. And actually we can have a better way of operating if we're able to communicate more freely, without me thinking that you're my superior and so I have to act a certain way. And one way that we're starting to do that in our workplace, and as I think many places hopefully are doing, is having more of these diversity, equity, inclusion committees that are discussing these ideas and figuring out how to do that together. And one practice that we've engaged in is just personal storytelling. So we're in a group. This is one committee that exists that has folks from all these different realms, students and professors and et cetera, and administrators. And we're all able just to tell our stories. And we just started with how have you either experienced some sort of discrimination or oppression, or how have you perpetrated some kind of behavior of oppression or discrimination? As even, because we all participate in both of those ways. And I think by sharing how we've all been harmed, but also how we all unfortunately harm each other is a way to equalize the power again and find trust and find connection and find shared vulnerability and intimacy, which is a really difficult thing to do in any kind of professional setting. But I think it's time now to start pushing those boundaries. What have you got to say about that, Omar?
I 100% agree, because the concept of engaging with people and how that builds power, like locally, and engaging with, like, for example, in order to form the JEDI committee, so the Justice, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Committee, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee, we emailed our faculty chair, or the department chair, and then the department, faculty, graduate students, postdocs, we all met together to talk about what are the steps that we can take. And we met with different we got information from different departments on what they're doing, what black students in NYU chemistry proposed. We took, and we of course we asked them before we took it, but we took it and we proposed it to our own department. And what came out of that were some really good discussions. When faculty members discuss, when a white faculty member discussed their experience with the police, in which when a police officer did something wrong in their community, they went to the police department and got that behavior rectified. I talked about, police meeting us with horses when we tried to go to a community forum to enact this. So how would it be possible to engage with this in your community and to enact these? Is to organize within your community, organize your fellow grad students. We're currently forming a chemical and biomolecular engineering graduate student council, and trying to get together and both organize, see what kind of resources that we have available to us, how can we ask for resources to make more resources available to us. And we're actually pitching to ask for certain resources from the department. After we've met together, we formed a constitution where we're assigning ourselves roles and whatnot. We're asking the department for certain resources for things we believe that we should have in order to effectively organize and build power amongst ourselves. So it's important to build power between your friends, with your department, have these difficult conversations, because they really do make a difference in building this power. And that's how you start. I mean, March for Science started because Ingrid Paredes, my co-chair, she approached me. She's like, "You organize protests. I want to organize buses to go to DC and bring people over to DC." And that's how March for Science New York City started. Ingrid just approached me, and we're both colleagues. She knows I'm an activist, and it launched from there. So that's sort of how things grow and manifest. And that's how you can affect change in your own community, is by meeting with your department and talking to them like, hey, we want to have a community outreach thing. Hey, we want to reach out to local high schools and teach at local high schools about the importance of this. Hey, we want to bring in a climate activist or a police abolitionist into the department to give a speech at the next seminar. So maybe not all seminars need to have a scientific speaker of some sort, but maybe we should have community activists come and speak, so that way we can learn how our sciences are directly affecting the community. So these are things that we can do, and they're completely within our wheelhouse, and they're not actually expensive. Departments, it literally costs nothing for the department to do all this. With that, we'll do the internal with, I'll give it up to Kendra for the internal, then we'll answer some of these questions.
Yeah. So yes, there's so many ways, right? So there's so many things to get involved and start to shift and change, but sometimes maybe how do you get to that point, and how do you tap into like what resources you may have, or what's going to be impactful. And I think a lot of that comes down to tuning in to yourself. Like you gotta, again, so coming into this internal world, how do we start to tune in? How do we start to learn about ourselves? How do we create a practice of figuring out like what's important to us, and also like what is already sort of happening around us naturally that we're observing of what's happening in our communities, what's happening in the social system, and start to make these connections. And I think in order to do that, we have to create more of an observational practice of mindfulness. And this is something that is not really talked about a whole lot particularly in science or academic communities, is how do we cultivate these healthy self practices of learning that, for me, science isn't just a tool for learning about our external world, but it's also a way of learning about my internal world also, because like I talked about, I think that that all of these patterns play out in our universe in different ways, and they're playing out within ourselves. And we also talked about how typically a lot of in scientific communities, there's a separation between the scientists and the science that's happening. You read a paper, a scientific paper that's all well, this chemical mixed with this chemical and made this chemical, but it wasn't me who mixed chemical A and chemical B and then maybe made a bomb. But it all happens kind of in this vacuum. And I don't think that we can do science for the sake of science anymore. I think that we can do science for the sake of curiosity, but I think that our curiosity has to be rooted in our love, like in our sense of self. And so in order to do that, we have to tune into ourselves and tune into our heart. As much as it's a crazy thing to say, love and heart in the scientific community, but I think it's imperative right now in the world that we're living in to learn how to connect with these things and to find tools and resources to understand ourselves better, and to know that we have to be part of these conversations. Our personal selves are part of these conversations, and we have to be advocates for the science that we're creating, and vice versa. We have to be a voice within science for the world around us, that we have to be that bridge. And what was the other piece of, and then but it's hard work, right? All of these things that we talked about, and I'm sure Omar would agree, all of the work that we've done has been a lot of pushing boundaries, and that takes courage. And sometimes it's scary, and sometimes people will be like, why are you doing this? You're disrupting everything, you're making it more difficult for everybody. And so how do you continue to do that work in a sustained way where you're not going to feel beat up all the time and feel like you're just getting more and more burned out? And I think in order to do that, again, you have to tune into your own sense of hope, but also your own sense of liberation, your need for liberation, for change. That it can't just be about helping other people. Like there's a lot of talk right now about helping people who are the most vulnerable. And while that is important to acknowledge that there's always people that are being harmed more than we are in the world around us, I think in order to do the sustained work of being able to advocate and support those people is to know that we also have skin in the game, that by them being harmed, we're being harmed also, and to figure out like what is our sense of, how do we want to find a sense of more curiosity and more expansion and more possibilities for ourselves in order that there can be more for others too. Because I think from what I've learned, that's where you have to find your sense of resilience for being able to do this work in a sustained and continuous way. What have you got for us, Omar?
I actually have a very personal, example. When I left Alabama, I grew up I'm a Southerner born and raised. When I left Alabama, I knew that, some of Alabama must have rubbed off on me. Some of that racism, some of that sexism, some of that homophobia must have rubbed off on me. I considered myself, when I was in Alabama, I was like, I am, a very progressive person. I'm very, tolerant. I'm very open-minded, all this other stuff. But I recognized that I might not be. When I went to Ohio for undergrad, one thing that I did was, attend LGBTQ sessions and just listen. If a friend told me that I said something and they're like, this is offensive, like, how dare you say this? I would listen. I went to, because sexual health wasn't really discussed in Alabama, we just had abstinence-only education. So, I had to go learn about, what is consent? What does it entail? All this other stuff. Like, what is, recognizing where can you go wrong and how does it affect others? And how do your own hangups, how does your own trauma affect others, is something that has been something that's guided me throughout my scientific journey. And honestly, it's something that has made me a better scientist. If I'm going to be fully frank, being able to see a paper that critiques a thought that's in my head, because we're on the fringes of knowledge, right? There people who are saying, oh, molecules come together and form crystals in this way, molecules come together and form crystals in that way, and people feel strongly about these things. But you have to be able to look at it and be like, all right, this data and this analysis indicates that this might not be real. Even though your data indicates that this is real, maybe your data is missing something, or maybe there's something that you're not considering when you're looking at how these two pieces of information play together. And so being able to look at yourself and to think, what am I doing wrong? How am I affecting others? How is my thought process healthy or unhealthy? How does it relate to my own health? How does it relate to the health of others? This is something that really, seeking therapy and whatnot really helped me be a scientist. And dealing with my own trauma, my anxiety, even something as simple as dealing with your own anxiety so you don't get locked up and procrastinate and not submit a proposal, or not submit an assignment at a time, or not do the research, or get locked up. This stuff requires internal health and internal taking care of yourself. And with that, I actually want to address one of the questions before do you think we should address a couple questions, Kendra, before we wrap up? All right, so I'll address one of the questions about the anxiety of the climate clock, right? So on one hand, a lot of criticism online has been, this is anxiety, this is just producing anxiety, and we see it. But for us, our perspective is that it actually can produce hope, right? It's a dynamic clock. It's based off of the carbon budget that's reported every single year, right? And so if we do well in a year, if we've taken a lot of good action in a year, and that clock goes from 7 years to 10 years, then that's indicative that we did good work and that we need to keep it going. If it goes down, then yeah, there's anxiety to it. There's the deadline is approaching, but that just means that we need to push our politicians to accept a Green New Deal, accept dramatic climate action. We can't just have, oh, we're going to build, some more solar cells, and by 2050 we'll be net zero and all that nonsense. Like, we need to actually fundamentally restructure our systems and really look at how do we transform ourselves. And right now, affecting power is, there's a bill out there. There's a concept behind a bill out there. There's, several bills out there that can do effective climate action that we can push. And advocating for a Green New Deal is just that. And so, you have a method to reach power. So go for it.
And I want to add to that also, because I also saw, when I first saw the climate clock, I was like, oh, so cool. And then I also saw a post like, is this really just stressing us out more, and who really has the power to change us? And I was like, oh yeah. And now I'm thinking about it too, like, well, I think you're right in terms of like who, okay, so that kind of thing is not gonna people who have the power are not gonna turn around and change over that. But I think, again, we have to recognize as a collective the power that we do have, right? And to start to shift from our space of feeling powerless to a space of feeling more powerful. And how do we and keep to and find our job, how to keep each other accountable in this work, and find the pathway that we're going to do, which I think, again, kind of connecting to some of these other questions, how do we start to, so like a lot of these questions are about what does it look like, what could change look like. Hi Simone, I get your question. What is the role of community spaces, and how do schools and undergraduates find programs to work with local communities? And again, this is, so it's like, how do we activate, how do we get there, and I think seeing we have to see the signs around us, not as the impending doom, but as reminders of, okay, how can we then look at what's already around us and see where the change can happen that's nearby. Like, what is the path of least resistance already? Because it is stressful, there is a lot of stuff happening, but the trick is to again tune into yourself so that you can kind of like go, like not be out here trying to solve everything, but okay, come back to center base, see who's around you, what spaces are around you, what community spaces. So like, you know, I'm in the East Village, there's the 6th Street Community Center, there's lots of good stuff happening over there. And like taking small steps, let me do a little bit of research, like what's happening? What are cool things that are happening over here? How can I make a connection? Maybe there's something, maybe I can just put two people in touch. Maybe it isn't even me like starting a program and doing work like that, but making these connections between other people. I think that's a big piece of the work, is just creating more networks of information and resiliency in our communities, and then finding different ways to shift those dynamics. And so then I think the other questions seem to be a lot based on funding, and how do we start to shift, how do we find out more about funding, and
I have a fun
learning
story
about
about that.
funding?
The EPA recently funded a research project for the farm, I think largely because March for Science New York City teamed up across different campuses to do this. So we have a project in the farm where we are decomposing plastics using mealworms and genetically modified bacteria and whatnot. So we applied for the funding for this project and we got it. And a huge part of this project was us talking about our activism and how our activism ties into our science. So don't shy away from, being an activist in scientific spaces. Don't shy away from being political in scientific spaces, because believe it or not, the people who are in science policy, the people who are scientists who are getting up there are also activists. So like, that's why I say like, we can't erase our activism, because a lot of people recognize this and a lot of people are activated. And it's not true that scientists are devoid of, that we're completely separated from this world, right? And even if they're not activated, they like it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Like, I mean, I struggle with this too. Like, funding is so hierarchical, and depending on and it has like a system, especially like grant funding has such specific ways that it is doled out. And typically, like, organizations that have more resources are better at getting more, and they know how to play the game in that right way. But I wouldn't let that be a barrier to entry also. Like, figure out how to start small. Like with our community sensor lab, we didn't have any funding, but we just cobbled together with something that was with pieces of things that were already happening, and figured out how we could build it slowly, and then started to just talk about it more and more, and people got more and more interested. And then they were like, well, I want to help out, and get creative with like how you can kind of cobble together. Because sometimes you just have to figure out like how multiple people can gain from a situation, and therefore like multiple people, you can have multiple investments from different places. And Allison, your comment, hey Allison, on being timid, I mean, I think it's just, again, tapping into like what's the important aspect of it for you, and how do you pull from that energy, from that sense of importantness, to be able to have those conversations, or to do that research, or to just like have the attention and the energy to find out more, and to keep going over and over, even after you fail over and over. Because I've certainly written grants over and over and over again, and had to just keep going, and eventually something comes through. And I don't also recommend, if you're doing a community-based project, try to get media involved. Like, try to write blog posts and get people who are good at writing or social media, because just having documenting your work is hella important to be able to tell the story and to have a narrative. And that's like always key to getting funding and to getting money.
If you have a friend who's a videographer, definitely like art and science tie super well together when you're science and when you're communicating your science. Something that I really want to stress on, because this is a huge conversation I had recently, is how do you navigate funding and ties with industry when industries are immoral? But that's where the money is for jobs and whatnot. That is a huge topic of conversation among scientists. For example, there's really good work that's happening under the Department of Defense. That's really good for like photovoltaics and renewable technology and stuff like that. But the fear is, if I go and contribute to the science, am I contributing to the military industrial complex? Am I contributing to a bomb that's going to go kill somebody? Am I contributing to an antenna that's going to redirect a bomb that's going to go kill somebody? And so this is something that you have to consider in the scientific world, how and in a way that, you know, my father's a professor and an engineer. He said you always have to ask yourself, how many degrees am I away from something evil, and am I okay with this? Because even if you're in academia, you're not separated from evil. You're not separated from, your new microreactor might be useful for making high-speed solar cells, but it also might be useful for making petroleum cheaper. So, how do you balance this out? How many degrees of evil are you from? What are the cost benefits that you're from? And this is something that, as a scientist, you must, or an engineer, you must really dig deep and realize, what am I comfortable doing, and how evil is this, and is it worth it? Are things that you really have to think about. An extreme case is Albert Einstein, the notorious pacifist. His theories ended up producing the nuclear bomb, but also, most of the renewable energy technology that we have today.
And I would add to that, what do you have the capacity to manage in terms of risk almost, so people, we all come from different backgrounds, we all have different needs to care for our families and these sorts of things. So how, and also, like, how can a lot of people say, well, I'm going to go into these spaces and I'm going to be a disruptive force. And I think that's like a great strategy to be a subtle infiltrator or a saboteur. And because I think, like, when I worked in industry, I tried to start more of these conversations. And I think somebody also asked about, like, how do we enter into these conversations more about, like, ethics and these sort of things. And I think so first, in regards to that question, that it doesn't have to be like a big project that we do, like everything change doesn't have to happen in these large scales. Like we just talked about these 4 levels that you can engage in, changing ideologies, changing institutions, but then there's smaller things with, like, changing interpersonal relationships, and then changing our internal world. And I think those are, like, good places to start, of just having small conversations with people in your classes, like starting out as if you're just an undergraduate, being able to have conversations about these things, or even if you're working in industry in these multinational companies that are doing questionable things, that start having conversations with your coworkers, or sharing articles, or having a discussion group, or creating a committee, and just being able to have a space to dialogue in order for ideas to start sharing. And then personally, just starting to sit with yourself more, of like, what's important, and how do I build courage and hope and optimism, and still acknowledge all of the things that are happening in this world. So I think it's like we're I'm going to throw up this image again, as we've got about 3 minutes left, to look at these 4 systems, and to consider, where do we feel called? Where do we have access to resources in different ways? And what are the opportunities that we can create for engaging at all these different scales, and the different systems and patterns and tools that we have available to us. Anything else, Omar?
Yeah, last thing, just if you want to get involved, just reach out to one of the orgs and get involved. Like, definitely at March for Science, like, just shoot us an email. info@marchforscience.nyc. Shoot us an email if you want to get involved. I'll shamelessly plug us in. Just contact people. There's so much work that you could do that other people can't do, and just hit them up. That's where, that's the best place to start. That's how I got started in college, is just hitting people up and joining their movements.
Yeah, and you can check out more about some of the work that I'm doing at the Advanced Science Research Center. If you just hit ASRC, Advanced Science Research Center Community Sensor Lab, and you can find contact information there too. And also check out my website, forloveandscience.com.
Love it.
Anything else? So great to have you. Thanks for following us and joining our conversation. And thanks, Omar, and the rest of the Cooper Union team. It was a pleasure to be here.
It was an absolute pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Kendra, and thank you to the Cooper Union team for having us, and thank you to all the people who watched and asked the really good questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but feel free to reach out to us and we'll answer them.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Need the music.